still in the book of Hebrews. We're going to be here for a while, I think, because Hebrews has so much richness to it. It has a tremendous amount of depth to it that you don't really ever notice or really take awareness of it until you actually try to study it and teach it. I don't learn half of anything unless I'm actually trying to teach it. Just reading through it, for me, I miss more than is really there. But one of the key verses to understanding the book of Hebrews is chapter 2, verse 1, where it says, "For this reason it is necessary for us to pay especially close attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away." So that issue of drifting away is really one of the primary focuses of the book. They had heard that message. They had heard directly from Yeshua, directly into the prophets or into the lives of the apostles, and then to those that then transmitted the message to them. So they're hearing that message. And they need to pay attention to that message so they don't drift away. And we remember that Hebrews was primarily written to a Jewish audience that had come to believe that Yeshua was the Messiah. But of course that was controversial. That was not accepted by everybody. And there was a lot of pressure on them because they accepted Yeshua as Messiah. There was a lot of pressure from those who didn't believe. From their brothers and sisters, the Jewish brothers and sisters who had not accepted him. And so they were pressuring these Messianic Jewish believers to go back, to give up on Yeshua and get back into the traditional life. And they pressured them through persecution. And in many ways that came about because of not being allowed to participate in the life and the activities of the temple. The temple was the focal point of Jewish life. Everything about their existence focused on that. 3 times a year the men had to go down to Jerusalem to offer the appropriate sacrifices for the feasts. That's why it was so devastating when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. But this is really coming before that. Because they were being persecuted and not allowed to participate. And so they would have to be asking the question, well, how is it possible? How is it possible for me to be right with God if I can't go through the prescribed course of that cleansing, of the offerings, if I can't offer the Passover lamb, if I can't participate in the Day of Atonement? How will my name be written in the book of life if I'm not included amongst the people of Israel? And so this passage comes along and says we've got to pay attention to the message so that we don't drift away. And we are encouraged to hold firm to the message of salvation in Yeshua. In other words, you are already in the right place. You are right with the Messiah. And to go back is what constitutes drifting away. To go back without Yeshua, that's what drifting away is. And if you pay attention to the message, that's what you're going to understand. And we need to understand a similar message, for each of us today. Most of us are not Jewish by birth. Most of us, we grew up in a different way of understanding the Scriptures, in a different way of understanding our walk with Messiah. But we've come to the conviction that the Torah is even for us and God's people. Not to be saved, but because we are. And we've come to believe in this rhythm of life that the Scriptures talk about, with the Sabbath on a weekly basis, the feasts. We've come to that conviction and how that should be for everyone. And faith in Messiah should never have drifted away from that. But in this understanding, in this direction, it's not always been easy, has it? It's cost us, almost everyone here has cost us something. It's cost friendship, it's cost family relationships, it's cost church fellowship in many ways and many times. And so we too might be tempted to go back as if this will fix the problem, as if we can unsee what we have seen. But we need to understand as well that this too would constitute this, drifting away. We need to understand and hold to that message and hold firm to it what we have heard. Because as one of the things that we'll get to here, we need to understand that we also are the seed of Abraham. You know, that's what this message is about, is holding firm, you who are the seed of Abraham. You know, we have taken on a new identity. We have taken on a new nature. We too have been changed. And we have to understand that we have been changed because of Yeshua, but we need to understand that He too was changed or took on a new nature. We were singing about it. It says, therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, He Himself likewise shared in the same humanity. Now, Hebrews has already in chapter 1 established the idea that He existed, before creation, that He was instrumental in creation. He is the radiance of God's glory and the imprint of His being. So what new nature did He need to take on? And it's this one here. He took on, He shared in flesh and blood. He shared in our humanity. Humanity was made in His image, yet Yeshua is taking on a specific nature. He shared in that humanity. He took on a nature in a way that He never did with the angels. That's what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, is how this is not, He is greater than the angels. And this is something different that's happening. He never took on the nature or the existence of an angel in that way. He didn't need this so much as we needed Him to have this. We needed Him to take on this nature, this humanity, to share in our humanity. Because remember, we talked about last week how, in comparison to the angels, there is no mechanism of salvation for the angels because they were not made in the image of God, nor do they die. They're not subject to death like that. So the state that they are in will last forever. And the decision to fall or to go with Satan and such by the third of the angels, that is a permanent state. Satan and his demons cannot be redeemed because they do not die. And the consequences of the fall for us, the consequence of our fall, actually makes redemption possible for us. We see that in verse 14. He says, therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, He Himself likewise shared the same humanity, so that through death He might break the power of the one who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who by fear of death were in bondage all their life. So in an ironic twist, death is the mechanism of our salvation. It doesn't make sense that this is the way it happens, but it does. Death was essential for us to be redeemed, so that through death. But it's not our death that does it. That's the penalty, that's the punishment for our sin, is that if we sin, we will die. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, so we should die. But it's not our death that saves us. Death is the punishment. Rather, it is His death that does it. It's that substitute of a spotless, sinless, unblemished sacrifice that is in our place. And that pattern has been the pattern from the very beginning. That pattern of the substitute. God spared Adam and Eve from death by doing what? By covering them in the skin of an animal. So the very first death recorded in Scripture came by God's hand in order to spare the life of the very first human beings. God provided the offering to cover their sin. That's been the story all along. And even Abraham expected God to do something like that when he was called to offer up Isaac. It's been part of the story. Genesis 22, then Isaac said to Abraham, his father, this is the Akedah, my father. Then he said, here I am, my son. And he said, look, here's the fire, and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And the two of them walked on together. Abraham didn't necessarily know what God was going to do, but he knew he was going to do something. When the time came to kill Isaac, Abraham still believed that God would keep the promise that he had made, that through Isaac would Abraham's offspring be reckoned. It was through Isaac that the promise would be fulfilled. And that can only happen if Isaac is alive. Abraham didn't know exactly, but he knew that Isaac was going to live because he believed that God would not break his promise. And we see that a little bit later. Then Abraham lifted up his eyes, and behold, there was a ram, just caught in the thick bushes by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of, or in place of, as a substitute for his son. Abraham named that place Adonai Yireh, as it is said today, on the mountain, Adonai will provide. Again, there has to be death, to be a death to pay for the sin. It should be the person who has sinned. It should be their life. But if, like the angels, if they could never die, then they could never pay. The death of an animal was only a temporary fix. The death of the animal, the sacrifice, was only a substitute, a covering. It was temporary. There was a reason why the Father prevented the fallen Adam and Eve from eating from the tree of life and living forever in their broken state and fallen state. If they had, there would have been no redemption. We would have had no hope. And we would have just been just as broken forever as Satan and the third of the angels. But because of death, there is hope of redemption for the people of God. He says, surely he is not concerned about angels, but about the seed of Abraham. This is the important thing for us to keep in mind. The angels don't have that path of redemption. We do. But it could not be a substitute or an animal or something less than what we are. Animals are not morally responsible. Death, in this sense, is a matter of justice. It's a matter of holiness. So the death had to be an equivalent. And a life for a life, a human being. But every Jewish person knew that their life was on the line. That there may come a day when their life would be accountable for their sin. But until that moment came, God had made a way for them to continue living through that sacrificial system of the sin offerings, through that system of atonement. But if these Messianic believers no longer had access to the temple, could no longer participate in the feasts like Passover, like the Day of Atonement, if the high priest would no longer represent them when he entered into the Holy of Holies, how could their sins be covered? You see the dilemma? This is a problem. And it continues to be a problem now that the temple is not there. But if the high priest, if the priesthood, if the authorities had kicked them out and renounced them because they believed in Yeshua as Messiah, what hope did they have to live? Their only hope would be to renounce Yeshua and return to the approval of the high priest and the functioning temple, unless God provided another way, like perhaps a different high priest. It says, therefore, Yeshua had to be made like his brothers in all things, so he might become a merciful and faithful Kohen Gadol, high priest, in matters relating to God, to make atonement for the sins of the people. Yes, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, makes atonement for the people. And yes, that is a big deal. to not be participating and being represented by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. That's when this happens. And what you'll read and what you'll notice, and when you read through the book of Hebrews, much of it centers around language of Yom Kippur, of the Day of Atonement. But this is a big deal to not be represented, and that truth and that reality was being used to intimidate them into returning. And they had that kind of pressure relationally from their family, from their friends, not participating, but they also had it theologically to give up and go back, just like we do today. But these Messianic believers need to know that they do have approval. They do have representation through another high priest, really the most legitimate high priest. That's who they are represented by. Yeshua is going to represent you in matters relating to God. They are not cut off. Just because they are not allowed to participate in temple functions, they are still represented before God. Yeshua, by his death, has made atonement for their sins. So now what reason do you have to consider going back? What reason do you have if your concerns are addressed by the faithful and true high priest? I have provided for you. That's essentially what he's saying. The Lord himself has provided for you. You don't need to go back. You don't need to seek their approval. You don't need to be afraid about being out of relationship with God, because the Son is representing you. And the author is going to come back to this later several times, but he's going to come back to establish how it's possible for Yeshua to be a Kohen Gadol, since Yeshua is not from the tribe of Levi, nor is he a descendant of Aaron. So those are both the requirements and conditions set up in the Mosaic covenant. That's what is the governing earth. That's what governs the earthly temple and in Jerusalem. But the author of Hebrews is starting to establish the criteria right here when he says, this is what he's doing. He is making atonement for the sins of the people. Now, what people is he talking about? You go back to verse 16. He is making atonement for the seed of Abraham. God is concerned about the seed of Abraham. And in some respect, Yeshua is the seed of Abraham, right? He is, the Galatians talked about that, about through your seed you will be reckoned and such. But when he's talking about in this passage, the seed of Abraham, is it just a matter of physical lineage or descent? Or is it also a matter of one who walks and believes as Abraham did? And walks and believes and trusts in the God that Abraham believed in. See, there is great benefit in being a literal descendant of Abraham. In Romans chapter 9 says, to them belong the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the Torah and the temple service and the promises. It's not as if the temple service is irrelevant. But he says, to them belong the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, the Messiah, who is over all, God blessed forever. Amen. But there is more to it than just being a literal fleshly descendant. Being a true seed of Abraham is about the promise and then walking in that promise. Because he goes on in Romans chapter 9 to say, but it is not as though the word of God has failed. For not all those who are descended from Israel are Israel. Nor are they all children because they are Abraham's seed. Rather, your seed shall be called through Isaac. That is, it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God. Rather, the children of the promise are counted as seed. The seed of Abraham has the same kind of faith that Abraham did. And so this is a contrast between those who are the seed of Abraham and those who are the literal descendants. This is the kind of faith that believes God, that trusts God, even if you don't always or fully understand what He's doing or how He is doing it. Do you believe Him anyway? Because you look back at the life of Abraham, and that's what you see from him. In Genesis 15, he says that God took Abraham outside and said, look up now at the sky and count the stars if you're able to count them. And then he said to him, so shall your seed be. Now that was the catch, because he had just come to God saying, who's going to inherit all of my life in this relationship with you? Because I have no children. My servant is going to inherit everything. And God takes him outside and says, no. You're going to have children. You're going to have seed. Look up there in the sky, and if you can count that high, then that's where you're going to be. But it didn't make sense. He didn't have all the answers. There was no explanation for how God was going to do that at this point. So what does he say? Then Abraham believed in Adonai, and he, or God, reckoned it to Abraham as righteousness. Abraham believed. Without having all the answers, without having all of the explanations. To have the faith of Abraham, you're going to have to sometimes believe without always seeing. It's not always going to be laid out right in front of you in a nice little, explanation. Abraham had the kind of faith that looked forward to the promise being fulfilled. He believed the one who made the promise. He was even looking forward to the Messiah and held on to that promise. During even an intense conversation with some Pharisees, Yeshua said this about Abraham. He says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was thrilled. So from that time to that point in his life, at some point when Abraham was believing the promise, he was able to see so far ahead that he could see the fulfillment of the promise through the coming of the Messiah. Something about that he was able to see and understand. He was given some wisdom or some insight into what God was going to do. Your father Abraham rejoiced, even though he wasn't there. Even though it wasn't the right time. He rejoiced at seeing the day of the arrival of Messiah Yeshua. He was able to see it and was thrilled. So what the author is trying to get the point across is saying is that you are in good company when you look to Yeshua, because even Abraham looked to him. You are the seed of Abraham if you look to Yeshua, as well as doing the things that Abraham did. Because he goes on, or earlier in this chapter, just as he said, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. Back in verse 39, he says, Yeshua says to them, if you are Abraham's children, you're going to do what he did. You're going to do the deeds of Abraham. You're going to live the way Abraham lived. See, Abraham saw Messiah even more clearly, I believe, than he could see the temple. So you to the audience, he's saying, you as a Messianic Jew, to renounce Yeshua is to not do or believe as Abraham did. Because Abraham saw Yeshua as Messiah. He saw that day and believed it. And if you go back and renounce Yeshua, you're not living as Abraham did. And those who hold on to Yeshua are proving to be the true seed of Abraham. And those that are rejecting Yeshua as Messiah are not doing what Abraham did. And they are proving to not be the seed of Abraham, the seed of promise. And the great thing is is that even Gentiles can be counted in this number, can be counted as part of the seed of Abraham. Paul makes this point in Romans 9. Even us he called, not only from the Jewish people, but also from the Gentiles. As he says also in Hosea, I will call those who were not my people, and her who was not loved, beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. The seed of Abraham's descendants, not just physical lineage, but those who joined themselves to his people, like the mixed multitude did in coming out of Egypt, like Ruth did in leaving her people, her father's house, and going to a land that she did not know, with Naomi, whose people would become Ruth's people, whose God would become Ruth's God. This has been a part of the story all along. Faith makes us a seed of Abraham. Calling upon the name of Yeshua makes us a part of that lineage of faith. He says, for if you confess with your mouth that Yeshua is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart it is believed for righteousness, and with the mouth it is confessed for salvation. It goes on, it says, for the scripture says, whoever trusts in him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, richly generous to all who call on him. See, that the whole thing about wanting to go back was that sense of shame and that sense of fear and that sense of how can I be represented before God. But you will not be put to shame when you call upon him. And he will count you among the seed of Abraham because he is Lord of all. We Gentiles are grafted into the tree, to that olive tree of Israel, into the root and the foundation of faith, and the story of redemption that began taking form in the call of Abraham. We are included in that lineage. The Gentiles were not included in the redemptive story unless they bound themselves to Israel like Ruth. We were excluded from citizenship. We were foreigners to the covenants of promise. But now, in Messiah Yeshua, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah. He goes on in verse 15, he did this in order to create within himself one new man from the two groups, making peace, making shalom, and to reconcile both to God in one body through the cross, by which he put the hostility to death. And he came and proclaimed shalom to you who were far away, that's the Gentiles, and shalom to those who were near. Both of them need to hear the message of shalom through Messiah. For through him we both have access to the Father, by the same Ruach, by the same Spirit. So then you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but you are fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household. God's household really starts with the calling of Abraham. And as the generations go on, you see that both Esau and Jacob were the literal seed of Abraham, but only one of them believed in the God of Abraham. That was Jacob. And so only one of them was counted as Abraham's seed, truly, because he was the one of promise. And you and I, we too are Abraham's seed when you believe in what Abraham did. When you look back on the same thing that Abraham looked forward to. That is the Messiah. And we have got to hold on to that. No matter what is going on, no matter what kind of pressure may be coming our way, we need to hold on to that which Abraham looked forward to. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 6. But Messiah, as son, is over God's house. Remember, he just said, you are members of God's household. But he says, Messiah, as son, is over God's house. And we are his house if we hold firm to our boldness and what we are proud to hope. That's chapter 3, verse 6 is what that should be. Now, why does the author feel the need to say this? Why does he feel the need? Because in the situation of the day, it was not easy to hold firm. The Messianic believers were torn. They were being told by those who claimed the lineage and authority of Moses, who sat essentially in Moses' seat, who controlled the house. They thought they controlled the house. And for all practical purposes, they did. They were told by those who thought they controlled the house, the temple, that believers in Yeshua are no longer welcome in the house. But ultimately, even those ruling the temple are not the ones in charge of the temple. The servant is not the master, nor does the servant have more authority than the son. And this is the point that he's really trying to get across. Messiah as son is the one who is over God's house. Messiah as the son is the one who has the authority. And we have to hold firmly to his declaration. He goes on and says in verse 1, this is again chapter 3, that's a typo there. Therefore, holy brothers and sisters, partners in a heavenly calling, take notice of Yeshua, the emissary and Kohen Gadol, high priest, that we affirm. He was faithful to the one who has appointed him in his house, as was Moses also. For he has been considered worthy of more glory than Moses, even as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses surely was faithful in all God's house as a servant, for a witness of things to be spoken later. But Messiah as son is over God's house. There's that again. And we are his house if we hold firm to our boldness and what we are proud to hope. See, too often what we see happen in coming this direction and coming to these understandings is we have a tendency to denigrate and tear down Moses, the Jewish temple, the Jewish people. That has been the tendency within faith in Messiah. But what he is saying in this whole section, 1 through 6 of chapter 3, that Moses is important. Moses is significant. But what Moses does as the servant of the house is that he directs people to the Messiah. He directs people to the Son. Because that's what the servant does. The servant directs people to the Master. He does not keep the attention on himself. The servant should never try to supplant the authority of the Master and think that he is more important than the Master. So anyone claiming to speak from Moses' seat or authority that rejects the Son is unauthorized, and their opinion should be rejected. So you, speaking to the audience of Hebrews, as a Messianic believer that has been kicked out of or denied access to the temple because you believe in Yeshua HaMashiach, you don't need to be concerned about being rejected by God because you are a true seed of Abraham and you have his approval. You have the approval of the Son and the Master of the house. The servant does not get to say and deny what the Son has authorized. Messiah is over God's house. Messiah is greater than Moses. But this passage does highlight that something important. You know, again, for too long in Christian history, in order to elevate Yeshua, they have often denigrated, insulted, or rejected Moses. But this passage actually teaches the opposite. Look at what it says about Moses, all the while saying that Yeshua is greater. It doesn't destroy Moses, it actually affirms him. So therefore, holy brothers and sisters, partners in heavenly calling, take notice of Yeshua, the emissary and Kohen Gadol that we affirm. He was faithful, talking about Yeshua, was faithful to the one who appointed him in his house. But someone else was also faithful, as was Moses also. Moses was faithful to the one who appointed him, to his role, to his function. Moses faithfully executed that duty. It goes on in verse 3. For he, or Yeshua, has been considered worthy of more glory than Moses, even as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. Now, what does that say about, it says about Yeshua that he has more glory than Moses, but what does it say about Moses? Does he have any glory for what he did and how he served and how he lived? Yes. Yes, he does. You don't want to ignore that reality, that Moses has approval from the Father and received glory for what he did. And then it goes on, for every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was surely was faithful in all God's house, as a servant for a witness of things to be spoken later. So again, what is it saying about Moses? Moses is faithful in what he did and how he served. Then it says, now Moses surely was faithful in all God's house as a servant for a witness of things to be spoken later. How did he show his faithfulness? Is that he was a witness to things spoken later. So you look at those three things. Moses was faithful to God, and you shouldn't ignore the fact that God appointed him to that role. Moses was faithful in all of God's house, in what he did and how he served. And then Moses was also a witness to things spoken later. Moses talked about things, established things, directed things that were going to become important later, especially when it comes to Messiah. And Yeshua himself established that in John 5. For if you were believing Moses, you would believe me, because he wrote about me. Again, this is all consistent with that. The faithful servant is watchful and doing what he is supposed to do when the master arrives. Moses is the faithful servant. Moses would recognize Yeshua as Messiah because he is one of the seed of Abraham. And those who claim to be speaking for Moses, who don't recognize Yeshua as Messiah, are not being faithful servants. Therefore, their judgments and their expulsions are not valid in the eyes of God. And they are not the final word on your status before God. And so that is not in question because of their pronouncements or their rejections. So just because you cannot participate in the temple, just because you can't participate in the Day of Atonement, does not mean that your sins are not atoned for. And that's an important thing for them to keep in mind, for us to keep in mind. And as we talk about this, as we talk about Moses, as we talk about how Yeshua is better and greater, we have to do so without tearing down and destroying or denigrating Moses and the faith that he represents, the faith that was put in place. And for us today, we have to, as Messianic believers, we often get accusations from both sides, don't we? From traditional Judaism, from anti-missionaries, Messianics are often treated poorly, even in Israel. Missionary ministries are denied official status. There was a court case that just came up about that in the last week. Messianics are denied the aliyah, the right of return. In other words, saying you're not welcome. Though that may be changing in the future as attitudes are changing in some sense, but in some sense hostility is increasing in others. from traditional Christianity, Messianic believers get it too. You're a legalist. You've abandoned Christ. You're not welcome. You'll be, and we have to understand that we'll be included in some form with the rise of anti-Semitism, because the world out there and most people are not going to know the difference, right? So they'll see us as the same. But again, it's their opinions and pronouncements should not push you or I to leave or abandon our convictions. We need to hold firm to Yeshua with boldness even in our days of testing, even in the days of trial and difficulty. Hebrews 3:7 goes on with that. Therefore, just as the Ruach HaKodesh says, today, if you hear his voice, in chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, established the fact that they were hearing the right voice. Do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness. There your fathers put me to the test, though they saw my works for 40 years. See, the author has already established that they have been hearing from God in believing Yeshua. So that generation of Messianic believers have heard the message, have seen even miracles, just like the generation coming out of Egypt. He says that back in chapter 2, where he says these things are established by these kind of miracles. But, so this generation has probably seen even more than we have in terms of those things, of the miracles and the move of God. But we must not harden our hearts to him and put the Father to the test. See, how we respond to the hardship is a form of testing. And a negative response tests him. It tests his patience. Tests whether he will follow through with his warning of judgment. Now, most of you parents probably know what this is like. You had moments like this where you've said something like that to your children at some point, where you've laid out the consequences of something that's happening. This is what we're going to do, but if you don't, this is what's going to happen. And you see that your children are starting to go in that direction because they don't really believe you're going to do it. Anybody had that situation come up? I've never had that situation come up. No. I promise, never. No. They don't really believe that you're going to follow through with what you have said you will do, with discipline, with be it spanking, grounding, going to your room, whatever. And you come back and you say, "Don't test me." Anybody else do that? Never? I'm the only one? Yeah. Don't test me means don't push it, or you will experience it. This is the kind of testing that he's talking about. There, your fathers put me to the test. They didn't really believe that he was going to do what he said he was going to do. And so they put him to the test. So we must hold firm to our faith even in the midst of our hardship, and even in the midst of rejecting, because there is also blessing that comes with holding firm. But he goes on, he says in this, verse 10, he says, "Therefore I was provoked by this generation, and I said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. And as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Take care," this is the author, again, he's speaking to his audience. "Take care, brothers and sisters, that none of you has an evil heart of unbelief that falls away from the living God." In other words, you guys don't do the same thing that they did. Don't fall into that same trap. Don't fall into that pattern of what they were going to do. These Messianic believers thought, or were tempted to think, that maybe their life would be better. That maybe things would go back to normal or settle down or be easier if they just gave up on the Yeshua thing. And we may be tempted in some ways like that as well. But verse 11 states very clearly that you won't find rest if you go back and deny what you have seen and what you have heard. Verse 11. as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. It's not going to get better if you do that. It won't make life easier. Rather, it's going to be harder. Those who drift, who go astray, who go back, they haven't really known Him or His ways in all of that. See, enduring conviction to the revealed truth of God is a sign that you know Him. Otherwise, you're just going through the motions. Otherwise, you're just jumping on the latest, the newest trend that has piqued your interest. And the author calls it an evil heart of unbelief. Instead, we must all, as this community of faith, hold firm, stand fast, and help each other to do that as well. He says, instead, but encourage one another day by day. We're going to need encouragement from each other. We're going to need support and strength from each other. We're going to need those things because the testing or the hardship is real. Encourage one another day by day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partners of Messiah if we hold our original conviction until the end. We need to encourage one another. It says, so long as it is today. And what we need to realize is that's a little bit of a play on words. So today is a certain day, but the day that's coming is called that day. Right? There's that day. And that day that he's referring to is the day of the Lord. Is the day of the coming of Messiah. The Lord's day. The true Lord's day. But we encourage one another to hold firm. Hold firm to Yeshua. Otherwise, our hearts can become hardened. We can become frustrated and hurt by all the attacks and difficulties that are coming our way. And it is ultimately deceitful. It's to get us focused on something else other than Him. And it encourages you to sin. And to break the Torah. Break our commitment to Yeshua. The truth that we must hold on to is that we have become partners of Messiah for a great and glorious cause, which is the kingdom of God. And what demonstrates that truth, that Messiah has changed our lives? Now, I'll ask you that, it's like, by what's one of the most important words in these two verses? Any guesses what an important word is? Encourage is one of the important words, yes? But it's not the one, huh? That's a good one, but no. Y'all, it's a lot shorter than that. Y'all are looking for big, important words. If. We have become partners of Messiah if we hold our original conviction firm to the end. If we don't hold our original conviction firm to the end, then that proves that we must not be partners of Messiah. We must not be one of the seed of Abraham. We have become partners. Can you imagine how significant that is? To say that we are partners of Messiah. We have entered into a working relationship where He is the one that is giving us the instruction. He is the one that's giving us the orders. He is telling us what to do. And usually that kind of language would be the kind of language reserved for the priests or the Levites. They are the ones that are in partnership with Him. They are the ones that are doing the ministry and the service of God's house. And He is saying, no. Just as Moses was a partner of Messiah, Just like Abraham was looking forward to Messiah, and they are serving him in certain roles and doing certain things, guess what? You can be as well. And you are a partner with Messiah. If we hold our original conviction to the end, we hold it firm. So we need to let this conviction, this foundation of faith, be laid on the solid rock of Messiah Yeshua. So that when the storms of life come, you and your house, right, which, what does it say about the Father's house? What does he build for us there at the Father's house? Many rooms or many mansions, dwelling places for us, right? If it's built and attached to his house, the Father's house, when the storms come, we will stand firm and it won't come crashing down. And so we continue in the promise as the seed of Abraham by faith, because Messiah Yeshua is concerned about the seed of Abraham. He has become like his brothers to bring salvation. He is our faithful high priest in the house of God, and he has asked us to partner with him no matter what anybody else says. That is the truth that we must hold on to. That was true for them in their day. And that is still true because it's still today, isn't it? As long as it is called today, it's still today. It hasn't become that day yet. So this is still true. As long as it is called today, we need to encourage one another to hold to our convictions, hold original convictions firm until the end, and not let anything or anyone sway you from it. And we're going to need it. As that day gets closer and closer, does it get easier or harder?
It's much harder.
It gets harder. And so we're going to need each other all the more as we see the day approaching.